All right, hello, good morning. Let's see. All right, so it was a little bit of a challenging topic because it's a broad topic in my mind because everything contributes to mortality. But I'll do my best to kind of walk you through at least kind of my way of thinking and some things that we've done that's actually really helped us out over the years. So just a little bit about New Fashion Pork. We're about 60,000 sows, and we market about 1.2 million pigs annually. We're pretty spread out, more spread out in terms of sows and grow finish. So most of our finishing pigs would be Minnesota, Iowa, a few nurseries in Illinois as well. And we are an owner member of Triumph Foods. So I feel like that gives us a little bit of a unique perspective, because our end isn't just getting the pigs to the plant, but through the plant. So we get phone calls about condemns and railouts and things like that. So all of that kind of goes into our decision making and our strategies is that we want to have a good product all the way to the consumer. So where do we start? So I really like this quote, but life is not a matter of holding good cards, but playing a poor hand well, right? So you get in a group of pigs, they're not so great, but you know what? If you do a good job and you work hard, you can really make something out of them. Because sometimes we're just playing the hand we're dealt. But sometimes you can deal yourself a good hand too. So we're gonna focus, the major part of my talk is gonna kind of focus on that. And then we'll kind of wrap up more with focus more on the nursery itself. So first off, we have to understand what pathogens we're dealing with. So if we don't understand this in the nursery, we're always in the firefighting mode. Pigs come in, they get sick, we treat them. Pigs come in, they get sick, we treat them, right? So if we want to get out of that, we need to go back and take several step backs and figure out, okay, what pathogens are there? When are they getting colonized or exposed? If we don't understand that, we can put in a vaccine, but maybe we're too late. Maybe they've already been exposed, maybe they've already been colonized. And sometimes even if you give something at birth, like maybe we're too late because maybe it's an in utero or a sow issue. So here's an experience that we had. We started seeing these pigs. You can see the date on the slide. It's several years ago, but 2011. And we started getting these pigs that had kind of this wrinkly skin. And you'd see them, they'd kind of wrinkle up, and this was like early post-weaning. They were lame, so you'd have non-weight bearing, carrying legs, things like that a couple weeks into the nursery. And it was like, well, what is this? So open up a few pigs and you find this. So you think, oh, it's HPS, now GPS. But you treat them with penicillin, they didn't get better. You'd run amoxicillin, they didn't get better. So it was like, well, it's something else. So digging into that a little bit more, so we did some serial sampling. So this is actually oral fluids, and this would be across pigs from weaning all the way through to market. So the red lines on there would be a Mycoplasma hyarinus. The blue would be influenza. There's a little tiny black section on there, and that would be your slipless. And I think if I have a pointer here, so it's right there. And then the yellow was Mycoplasma hyalocinoviae. We also tested for circovirus. There's no positives on here, so we didn't find any circovirus all the way through. And that little tiny blip of Erie, it's like, okay, it's probably not that. And sure enough, that was the day they ran vaccine. So we picked up our vaccine. And so, okay, well, it looks like this is Mycoplasma hyarinus. Didn't know a lot about that, but dug into that a little bit more. We also looked and split that up between barrows and gilts. So interestingly enough, we saw a little bit more of it in our gilts and our barrows, but sure enough, that carried all the way through. So we were seeing these issues in the nursery, but then carried through into the finisher, into a lot of our lameness issues that we were seeing. So we wanted to understand a little bit more. So with some help from Maria Clavejo with the University of Minnesota, we did some sampling in the sow farm. And as you can see, the pigs were positive very early on. So that's day one. So there wasn't very many of them positive. So here's a percent positive is the black lines, but the amount was high. So a few pigs positive with a lot, and then we don't find it, and then time goes on, and they commingled in the nursery with all their buddies, and now everybody's got it, and they've got it in a high amount. So again, this farm, we can't get ahead of this by putting a vaccine in at processing even. We're gonna be too late. So the next farm, we did the same sampling because every farm's a little unique, and maybe we'll have a little bit of a different prevalence. It was slightly different, but fairly similar. So we still had, again, pigs that were prevalent there early in pre-weaning, and then a high amount, and then once they got into the nursery, it shed to everybody. So the third farm was a little different, and this was due to some other factors, but we really didn't find any until those pigs actually got split out into finishing, and then they broke with influenza, and then they blew the doors off. So then we had polyceratitis, pericarditis, lameness, but now finishing. This particular farm actually had been more heavily medicated, and so they had gone through PRRS breaks and other things, so most likely in hindsight, we probably just pushed that out, but again, we never got rid of it. So even though we looked for it, that little tiny bit that was there blew us out later. So just one example of kind of digging in an unknown pathogen and kind of understanding the dynamics of it. So what we did is then we would go through and obviously implement that into our gilt vaccination strategy. But of course, as mentioned yesterday, which I thought the presentations were excellent, we certainly know we have to have colostrum intake as a young pig. We know sow conditioning is a factor into that, and of course, piglet immunity. So if we are going to take the time to vaccinate these sows and these gilts, we sure need to make sure that these piglets are getting that colostrum and that they're gaining immunity from those gilts and from those sows. So for us, we don't typically do any standard medication pulses to the sows. We really want to try to target what pathogens are there. So we found out, though, once we pull a lot of those, that you find out that there's things that are there that you didn't realize. So for us, we found that there's a low level of erysipelas across the company that we typically didn't see in the past. So lots of things probably contributed to not seeing that. Historically, we used a lot of penicillin in sows. And obviously now we don't, and now we don't have those medication pulses. But the other thing to think about by medicating is are we preventing colonization by good bacteria? And so certainly there are definitely times that we need to do medications, and if we were eradicating mycoplasma, if we're unstable with viral challenges that are causing a lot of secondaries, certainly they're beneficial. But here's just an example of some microbiome sampling that we did. So digging down just a little bit deeper into how some of these things are impacting other things. So looking at poor pigs versus healthy pigs. So on the poor pigs, as one would expect, we saw more Clostridium difficile than on the healthy pigs, sure enough. However, on the healthy pigs, we saw more Streptococcus species. So we thought, well, that's interesting because those pigs we sampled didn't have a strep issue. So we broke that down a little bit farther and looked at different days of age. So this farm, we actually had a couple different things that we were digging into, but the stars are all indicating strep. So we found a lot of strep. Again, we didn't have a strep issue, and so I highlighted the strep in red. So those are different sorts of streps, none of them being strep suis. So the theory about this is that we had all these other streps that were actually outcompeting the strep suis, and AKA we didn't have a strep issue. So had we heavily medicated this farm, would have we gotten rid of these other streps and now caused ourselves a strep problem? And potentially yes. Another thing that was interesting about this work that we did is that we also uncovered this. So this is this Elizabethia, and actually renamed Chrysiobacterium. So that's actually a problem in people, in neonates, and also in the elderly. And it's naturally antibiotic resistant, it's naturally disinfectant resistant, and we didn't even know we had this. And this was over numerous submissions to numerous diagnostic labs, but just happened to uncover it with this deeper look at what we have in the microbiome. So we certainly do think that this is contributing to the health of this farm, especially considering that 30% of the microbiome at birth of those pigs is this bacteria. That's a big deal. So I would encourage all of you to take a deeper look and deeper dive into what you might have underlying. So another thing, with all these changes and things that you're going to go through, this isn't meant for you to look through all of these things, but it's just meant to track it, right? So this is just something simple, something basic, an Excel spreadsheet. What was the farm name? What date did it occur? What group did it affect? When did it start? When did it stop? What was the dose, right? Because if we aren't tracking these changes that we're making, how can we really make sense of those things in the end? So this is an example. This is over a couple-year time period. The orange line on top is actually the wean age, and then the bars are actually the finishing mortality. So this is a flow that constantly gave us trouble, and it kind of still gives us trouble today. But of course, we have a higher finish and mortality in PRRS. We'd always struggled with GPS, HPS at the time. And so we said, okay, let's try some Palmitil. So we went along with Palmitil, and initially it looked good, lower nursery mortality, like, wow, this is great. But then as you can see, overall mortality really didn't get any better until we actually put vaccine in place. And then you can see a nice trend going forward after that, which has continued. So again, that short term, okay, this is working, but then as we followed it out, it really wasn't working maybe as much as we thought it was. So another thing, a really important thing, of course, is your Gilt Development. So we like continuous flow GDUs. We want to have entries coming in at least once a month. We want good exposure, especially for farms that are mycopositive. We need that to stabilize those farms. So again, that's a communication piece, because people typically say, oh, they're coughing, I got to treat them. And it's like, no, we want them to cough. We want them to get the myco, and then our downstream will stabilize. Another thing that we do in the GDUs is an intentional staph exposure, and that's a prevention for greasy pig downstream. We also take the opportunity to booster our mature gilts. So we know a lot of them would have gotten wean pig, vaccines, Circo, Mycoplasma, GPS, Hyorinus, but again, we don't expect these to be lifelong. So we're going to booster them as a mature to carry them in through their first time they're bred and beyond. And then we also do farm-specific rota exposure, and I think there was a lot of learnings in PED. When we found out that we got these pigs exposed to PED, they had, it was through the barn, no question, and then as a mature gilt, they were bred, and then the farm would break with PED later, and it's like, what's going on? So we learned that we need to expose those gilts again as matures, and rotavirus is no different. So this was our lesson that we learned on staph. So we actually had a severe outbreak on a farm. So as you can see, these sows were greasy. So sows, pigs, it was terrible. It actually went on for quite a while. We tried multiple different strategies, and finally ended up growing up an inoculum and then applying it. And we used a slap tattooer just because we had it and it worked. And we found that we had to get that deep enough to penetrate to get into blood. 3 to 5 days after you applied it, you'd see a scab, and we did a whole herd vaccination of this, and we saw a light switch response, or a dramatic response, in 2 weeks after we did that. So really, really worked really well for us. I'll caution you though, if you do this, it has to be specific to the farm. So you can't take a staph from another farm and apply it to your system, that sort of thing. They are farm specific, but that works really well. So pitfalls, so of course it's live, so you got to keep it alive. You need to get the inoculum deep enough. So as people are applying that, if they dip their tattooer and then hit 3 or 4 or 5 sows, you're going to get the first one, but not the rest. So dip it every time, that sort of thing. And of course, and ironically, on this very farm, about 3 years later, I was looking at the vaccine usage, and it's like, man, you haven't ordered any staph vaccine for 6 months. He's like, well, do we have to still keep giving that? I'm like, yes. So how quickly we forget, right? So I'm not seeing it, I'm not having a problem, why do I have to keep giving this? But obviously we need to keep giving it to our gilts. And we have found that some farms, we do need to add a second strain because that one initial strain wasn't enough to protect us. So another pathogen that we've kind of struggled with, and we had some initially sow issues. We had NIPs, we had a lot of opens, we had some other just kind of strange things. We actually even had a sow that had PDNS, submitted tissues. We only got PCV3 back from this sow. So we said, okay, well, we're really struggling also with the wean pigs. So the wean pigs would come in, they wouldn't start. We'd have just a strange fallout, and the more of the fallout would be kind of that 2 to 3 week post-placement. And they just wouldn't eat, So we grueled them, we treated them, you name it, we tried it. Nothing worked. And so this is actually our processing fluid testing we have from 2 different farms. So we're kind of running down in the 20s. What these CTs, if you're not familiar with these, low CTs means a lot of virus, right? The more the cycle has to run, the less virus there is, and up to a 40 would mean negative. So lots of virus here, and then all of a sudden we had this nice jump up. We weren't completely negative, but we were doing pretty good. We had a couple hiccups here. Same thing here. So these sow farms are both vaccinated at the same time for PCV3. And as you can see, it was very repeatable that we had our jump up to basically negative at the same time. I would attribute these little dips to probably some gilts or cells that got missed on our vaccine. However, after that, here's our nursery mortality. So again, kind of same time frame. So this was kind of pre-vaccine, when we had those positive CTs on the lower mid-20s, and then a nice drop and a nice continued lower mortality for both of these flows. So again, something to think about if you have that as an underlying issue. So another thing that we did, again, I mentioned that we uncovered that erysipelas. So we do a lot of vaccinations for that. Oddly enough, Erie isn't a one and done thing. And Mycoplasma hyarinus, as I mentioned as well, is a leading cause of our mortality and our lameness and grow finish. So we vaccinate for that as well, and we continue to do that, and we continue to booster those. So why is it that erysipelas, why doesn't the vaccine work like it used to? And it's because we have a lot of variation. So this is actually a dendrogram. This is actually vaccine strains. These isolates here were actually taken from sites not vaccinated, so they matched up pretty well. But then you start to get into these branches, and as you go up and over, you get a lot of difference here. So here we have all these other erysipelas strains that are actually pretty different from our vaccine. So what we found is that more that you give the vaccine, the more cross protection you get, but it's not complete and it's not perfect. And so we also looked into, okay, can we maybe look at a probiotic or a bacillus type strain? So we did that with some of our erysipelas strains, but unfortunately, this is weak inhibition and that's good. So we're pretty weak. So even some of those other things, although they do help in some areas, unfortunately for this, they didn't give us much help. So another thing that we've done as well over the years is PCV2. So we kind of learned the hard way on that we had instability. We were finding a lot of virus in the nursery. We were seeing early nursery mortality, and we've had to go through and we've had to vaccinate cells for that. In addition to that, so we have all these vaccines, all these things in place. So we put a lot of time and effort into vaccine compliance and monitoring. And you know what, if you look, you're gonna find it. And at least we can correct it, and that's the hope, right? So here's our nursery sample of tissues for PCV2. This was taken like 2 weeks into the nursery, so that's a lot of virus. And again, if you give a shot at weaning, you're not getting ahead of that. I'm not sure if you're not getting ahead of that even at processing, which in historic trial data would tell you isn't the best time to give your PCV2 vaccine anyway. So we went ahead and we vaccinated sow farms. So again, not a trial, but a before and after look. So we had our average nursery closeout mortality sort of before and after here. This farm was PRRS positive beforehand and not after, so it's a bias, but it is what it is. And then we saw another drop, another drop, another drop. These two farms actually went PRRS positive after, but I was actually pretty happy because typically with a PRRS flare-up, you kind of flare up everything else, right? So I think historically we would flare up PCV2 as well, but in this case, we only flared up PRRS, so although it was an increase in mortality, it wasn't a dramatic increase, which was a win. And as you can see on the finishing side, that trend continued. Overall, a nice reduction in overall mortality from stabilizing those sow farms. And again, I mentioned that earlier, but this would have been after we had done the whole herd PCV2 vaccines. So again, to test that theory, like did we really get rid of it? Did we really stabilize it? And yes, we did, because we didn't find any circle all the way through on oral fluids, and that's from wean to market. So I mentioned on looking at vaccine compliance. And so unfortunately, this is a sow farm that's not doing the greatest on that. But the red line here is actually their implied usage of vaccine, and the blue is what they should have used. So I circled the obvious problems. So should have used it, didn't use it, and we're investigating some potential downstream PCV2 right now on this flow. So even though it's a well-vaccinated farm, you got to keep giving it. You can't stop. So I mentioned this already, but again, colostrum intake, we know high born alive is a challenge like we talked about yesterday. We know split suckling is critical, and especially making sure that those smaller and those medium-sized pigs get that. And of course, we want to maximize our wean age. We know there's constraints, and we know some farms are just not able to have as high as the wean age as others, but maximize it absolutely as much as possible. So we like to do the majority of our vaccinations at the sow farm, and why is that? Because we have a manager that's there every day. You know, we can better manage that and monitor compliance. We orally dose K88 and Salmonella for nursery challenges, and we found that if we have to push that out, like let's say for PD reasons, we don't want to be picking up handling pigs, and we push that out, we dose that later, we'll have a lot more issues with scours and K88s and Salmonellas. So getting that into that week or so at least prior to weaning really helps. F18, of course, they've got to be 21 days, so that we would give that in the nursery. And then we do our specific autogenous strains that we found for strains in the farm, and we typically do that at processing and weaning. We also orally drench vitamin D at birth, and we've seen a nice reduction in humpbacks from doing that. So barn cleaning, I can't emphasize this enough. So we've seen some recent struggles with some severe F18s that don't seem to respond to vaccines, and we can't seem to treat them. They're resistant to antibiotics. So barn cleaning is our best friend. So can we depopulate these barns? Can we get the entire thing depopulated and clean? Don't forget the chute. Barn inspections, so it's hard to see. You're in there washing, it's foggy, it's hard to see, there's no question. So anticipate several touch-ups, depending on your washer, depending on how many times you've done this, minimum of 2 or 3. And again, use degreasers, like the water cups are really hard to always get clean, and obviously we're hoping that they have hot water, but they may not. How complete is your disinfectant coverage? And then what about the water lines and the biofilm in them? You've done this great job, you've got your barn really clean, but then I have this biofilm in the line that's probably harboring a lot of the bacteria that's in my barn. So what have we done to address that? So barn inspections, I like to call them the devil you know, right? It's what you had in the farm before, and it's what you're going to get again. So what can we do to prevent that? So just a couple, the inside of the gate was missed, a couple spots on the floor. Sometimes it's not a big deal. It doesn't take very long, but again, just finding those little spots like that and touching that up makes a really big difference in the long run. So we had a summer intern this past summer dig into a little bit of our water quality. And so I'm guessing you can all pick out the 2 sites that were on rural water, right? So the Googie East and the Googie West sites. So that biofilm carries a lot of bacteria in it. We did some testing on it, and the lab actually got back to us, and they said, we're spending so much time trying to identify what's all in here. Can we just run next generation sequencing? Because we think it's going to be faster. So there was bacteria that couldn't even be identified that were in there. But the bucket that's there to the right, that's actually what happens when you run that line cleaner through, and that's the initial water that comes out. So of course, you're just pulling what's in here out, right? Which it's not perfect. We wouldn't expect to have one line cleaning and completely clean the lines, but you're at least reducing it, and hopefully if you're doing it every turn, you're maybe able to get it back to the good, where you want to be. So we also looked at water flow rate. So we all, know, we just saw how dirty those lines are, right? And so looking at optimal flow rate, so here we have in red, so that's 250 to about 500. As you can see, we had some sites, and sorry to explain this further, each one of these is actually a different site, and each dot is a drinker that was measured. And so this is just variation across all these sites. So we had at least one drinker in all these sites that was not working at all, but then as you can see, some of them were getting up awfully high. But the average on here is a lot higher than where we want to be. So probably what's happening here is we're getting a lot of that buildup in the lines are plugging up, so guess what? I'm going to turn up my pressure. That way I can get the water out, right? So that works fine for the lines that are half clogged, but the ones that aren't clogged, now our pressure just keeps going up and up and up. And what do we think is going to happen when a wean pig hits that nipple and it sprays them in the face, right? They're not going to drink. So we know how critical getting water into these pigs is. If they don't drink, they don't eat. So again, taking another look at that, trying to go back and get these lines cleaned and get our pressure regulated, and that can be something pretty easily overlooked, but of course it's a big deal. So how do we get all these things done? So checklists are certainly helpful, but it isn't just handing somebody a checklist and say, hey, go do this, right? It's walking through the checklist with them, having those discussions with them. Did they blow out the water cups? Are the walls clean? How about the gate feet? Those are always what gets missed. Is there evidence of disinfection? Are we seeing any kind of foam? Can you smell the disinfectant? Is there an empty jug? Just kind of going through all those things to make sure that we're getting everything done that we want to and need to get done. So disinfection. So again, can the equipment you're using give you the rate that you need? And so this is actually, I just grabbed this out. This is a foamer that we use. And it's pretty simple, right? So you just measure your water flow out of your pressure washer. And so let's say that's 5 gallons per minute. And if my disinfectant rate requires 2 ounces per gallon, so I need a 10 ounce per minute tip. So I need, somewhere in there, either the red one or the yellow one, right? However, if I have a disinfectant that I need to have, let's say, a substantially higher rate than that, I might not be able to get that if my max on this is only going to be going up to 50. So make sure that we're actually calculating these things and looking at this. Also, if my water flow rate's a lot higher, that's going to push my tip need to be up higher as well. Again, measure monthly disappearance and monthly usage, and make sure that it's targeting the pathogens intended. We have a lot of good intentions of, I wanted to be really thorough, so I use bleach. And it's like, well, that's great if your water pH is neutral. But if we get a lot outside of neutral, our bleach might only be giving us about 10% efficacy. So again, stick with the disinfectants that we have data on, that we know work. So we like to do, if we get into a really sticky spot, like PD or some of these bad F18s, we like to whitewash. Why? Because it's simple, it's easy to mix. We don't use any salt, so the historical mix for whitewash is meant to actually keep a coat on your outside of your house or furniture for 50 years. So you'd add salt and you'd go through a slating process. We don't need to do any of that. So we're just mixing hydrated lime and water. We spray it on with a garden hose. However, of course, it becomes like a paint, so you'd better make sure that you flush that out once you're done, because otherwise your equipment's going to seize up. But we really like it because you can tell exactly where you've been and what's been covered. So this is a site that would have been done. This would be kind of a typical mix thickness. If you start to get it a lot more dilute than this, you'll be able to see that it'll visually be much, much thinner. And of course, like, these are all the spots we missed. So you can see it, and I would imagine that if you're using Synergize or any other disinfectant, you're probably missing those same spots, you just don't know it. So at least we can go back, we can use a pump sprayer, we can hit these spots before those pigs come in. And generally, if it's put on thick enough, it takes them about 2 weeks to wear it off. So you go into the barn and it'll actually cover everything, which we like a lot, because PED, we know that if we have 70 degrees for 7 days, we're going to kill it. So if this covers every surface, and if it stays on there for 2 weeks and our barns are warm, it takes care of it, right? So even if we've missed something, it's taking care of it. So feed. Feed them correctly, right? The nutritionists do their job, they make the diets as they need to be, so we just need to make sure that it's getting fed right. This particular bin actually was supposed to be a stage 1 only bin. It's not just stage 1. So there's actually a mix of stage 2 in there, which we color it so it's red, so we can tell that. There is some stage 1 right here, but then there's also something else in here as well, right? And these pigs were scouring, they weren't starting very well. Well, they were getting a blend. They weren't getting the diet that was intended. So we want to make sure that we're not skipping diets. We want to make sure they're running bins in tandem if they can. Otherwise, we know we're going to have mold issues. We also want to make sure that we're trying to target every age that we can in the barn. Now that's never going to be possible, so we're always going to have to maybe bring in some additional, maybe it's oats, maybe it's a flavoring agent, maybe it's an intensive care type diet, or something for that bottom end, depending on how big your bottom end is, right? But we just need to do what we can for the size of the pig we have. So biosecurity, so of course we want to make that simple and easy to follow. We never expect anything to be 100%, but we're at least hoping that one of the layers is going to catch it, right? So we just anticipate that corners are going to get cut, because they always do. But we want to make sure we're at least providing the tools that they need to get the job done, right? So in this situation, this is a double wide. It was never built with biosecurity in mind. So we're doing the best we can with the situation we have. So this pan has traffic cop in it. Our clean dirty line is right around this. So we're still able to walk around this to get into the barn, and we leave our outside shoes here. So it's better than nothing. It doesn't have a shower. In fact, the flow, we have a flow that has a lot of these barns in. Our employees follow it to a T. That's probably the flow that we've had the least amount of PED in since PED's been here. So they do work, but again, everybody has to be on board with it. So I like to think of this as the danger zone. So the dead box, so we know that this is going to be, in addition to trucks that are dirty, dead box is going to be our absolute highest risk, right? So anything around that dead box, we're going to drag that back into the site. So we've done all this good hard work in getting the barn clean and the lines clean, and then we bring it back in. So anything we can do there, if we need an additional dead cart, if we need dead sleds, we just need something so we don't have to bring that back into the barn. So, of course, I couldn't leave you without. Now you'll think about that anytime you see the dead box. Okay, so staff training. So of course you have to follow up and you have to review that often. We know that biosecurity, it's hard to understand, right? It's something you can't see, and so we have to review it often, and it's gonna always be inconvenient. We have a software manager, I really like her quote, and it's, if my biosecurity isn't an inconvenience to you, you're probably not doing it right. And that's just how it is. So color code things, use pictures. We have a really good staff and really hardworking staff, but keep in mind that sometimes they can't necessarily read English or Spanish. So color coding pictures are helpful. Don't take for granted they know how to identify sick pigs. A lot of the people that we're hiring now haven't ever been around a pig. They might have had some experience with other animals, other species, but they just don't know. So take that time to one-on-one go through there with them. And then, of course, make sure everybody's on the same page, whether that be ventilation, whether that be feed, whether that be vaccines. It does no good for me to go into a site and change ventilation and having somebody come after me and change it back again, right? And the grower or the producers, you're super confused about, okay, what's right, what should have I done, right? Everybody needs to be on the same page with that. So ventilation, so that's a tough one. It helps to have a set guideline. So it's not going to be perfect, but at least if they're following the guideline, you're probably not going to have a train wreck. So at least you can adjust off that guideline, make small adjustments. Try to use objective tools to measure if at all possible. Velometer, you can check airspeed, you can check humidity, you can check temp. Because I walk into a barn, I'm always cold. So I walk in and it's like, oh, it feels cold in here. The next person walks in, man, it's hot in here, right? So then if we're going by feel, we're gonna really start to muck things up and we're gonna yo-yo things pretty fast. Target for wean pigs, coolest part of the day, right? Because we are gonna do more damage if we chill them than anything. They can handle it to be a little hotter, and if we happen to move fast to hot air, that's okay. But we wanna try to keep them warm at night. And then we'd like to have only trained staff do adjustments. Again, it's not an easy concept to teach, and typically very good intentions have poor outcomes. So, it was gassy in here, so I figured I'd just open some more inlets so they could get more air. Well, what happened? We just made it more gassy, right? Because we opened more air inlets, we slowed our airspeed, we pushed pit gas up. And so they thought they were doing a good job, and they thought they were helping, but they actually just made the situation a whole lot worse. So we like to have a placement plan, so at least it tells us, get everybody on the same page, the grower, the staff, okay, this is how we're gonna place pigs, this is where they're gonna go, this is how many go into each pen. We get our stocking densities at least close to where we want them. We also have a dedicated wean pig specialist, and he gets the barn warm prior to placement. We make sure our mats are in place. If we need the brooders for winter, we get those in place, and then we get our rotecnas and our gruel bowls all in place. And just give an example here. So this would be an example of our placement plan. So we already know ahead of time, these are the pens that we're gonna have, that we're gonna leave. So the small pens on the bottom, those are pulled on arrival. So we're filling those up right away. And then within 5 days, we have another set of pens that we're filling up here. So again, those are your non-starters. So we have a target, we know where they're gonna go. Then we have our 10-day pen, and so those would be typically our sick pens, right? They didn't come in small, weren't non-starters, they were good, but they fell out later. So where do they go? They go here. And then we have another set of pens that we also leave for just additional pulls later in the turn. This has been really helpful for us. When I come into the site, I haven't been there, ever since the pigs have arrived, but I might be coming in at a point in time. I can, with a quick look, see, okay, the smalls look good, the day 5s look good. Geez, it's our day 10 pens that are struggling, right? So this isn't a sow farm issue. The pigs are coming in good, they're getting pulled good, they're getting taken care of issue. This is more of a disease issue, maybe that's occurring in the nursery. So at least this gives us some insight and some what we can work with. And again, I mentioned earlier just the checklist. So the wean pig specialist would have kind of all of these duties, but looking at clean dirty lines, are they in place? Are boot bands in place? Is the office clean? All of those things that they need to check on and make sure that is in place when the pigs start. So again, we know that we can deal yourself a good hand. We want to understand the timing of the pathogens that are coming in. We want to know when they're getting colonized. We can develop strategies then. Do we live with them? Do we try to vaccinate our way through it? Do we eradicate them? We want to make sure our gilts are acclimated and vaccinated. So again, acclimate to rota, to staph, to your myco-exposure, maybe vaccinate for PCV2 or others. We might need to vaccinate sows as well as a continual program. Maybe just vaccinating the gilts isn't enough. Maybe we need a pre-farrow booster for some things. We know colostrum is really important. We know wean age is really important. And piglet vaccination to target those major pathogens. But once we get to the nursery, we can at least make sure it starts clean, right? We can have a clean nursery, that we don't have pathogens from the last turn. We can check and make sure that our water flow rate is really good. We can start with clean water lines. We can get them fed right. Our ventilation, we can make sure that that's set right. Our biosecurity, so once we got started, we got good pigs, they're getting fed right, they're growing good. We don't drag a lateral PRRS into that site and muck it up. And then we also want to make sure that our management's all on the same page, so we're continually training, we're working with staff, we're making sure that we're kind of one voice, one message on what we're teaching and training, and then review. So with that, that's my son. He's a hockey player, baseball player, and that's his new big puppy. So thank you.